So based on my opinion, the number one business requirement is the storyteller want to head and track with their customer data. If the type of customer are teams, it will get a discount. The tracking of inventory item is a very important part of the business, as well as the description and price. We currently track the item name, color, size, and item category. This retail will record order from the customer. They will record purchase detail, the date, each price of items, number of items, size, color, total price. The retail want to their salesperson are handling different customer. Number two is based on the story and my opinion. The entity was customer, items, transaction, salesperson, and order. 5 entity. Number three is entity with attribute mandatory and optional. Customer ID mandatory, customer full name mandatory, customer address mandatory, customer phone number mandatory, customer email mandatory, team's name optional. Why optional? Because there is a customer that may be individual type. Customer type mandatory. Items ID mandatory, items name mandatory, item description mandatory, item price mandatory, item stock mandatory, items category mandatory, items color optional, item size optional. Transaction ID transaction ID mandatory, date mandatory, total price mandatory, discount teams optional. Salesperson ID mandatory, salesperson full name mandatory, salesperson address mandatory, salesperson phone mandatory, salesperson email mandatory, total commission mandatory, commission rate mandatory. Order ID mandatory, order items mandatory, order date mandatory, order quantity mandatory. For the unique identifier, customer had a customer ID and customer full name. That is unique. On items, there is an items ID and items name. The unique. Transaction, just transaction ID. Salesperson is salesperson ID, salesperson full name. Order, just one order ID. Optionally and cardinality. Customer to order, one to many. One customer can order a lot of items. Order to customer, one on one. One order on behalf on one customer. Customer to salesperson, one to many. One customer can do many complaints with salesperson. Salesperson to customer, one to one. One salesperson only allowed to handle one customer. Order to transaction, one to one. One order data can be output on one transaction. Transaction to order, one to one. One transaction data based on one order. Salesperson to transaction, one to many. One salesperson can handle a lot of transaction. Transaction to salesperson, one to one. One transaction can only be handled by one salesperson. Transaction to item, one to many. One transaction can include one or many item. Items to transaction, one to one. One item can be set one transaction. Number 6 is number 7. The customer, there is an attribute customer ID, customer full name, customer address, customer phone, customer email, teams belongs, customer type. Their primary key is customer ID. Their alternate key is customer phone, customer email. There is an order had an attribute, order ID, order date, order quantity, order item, customer ID. Primary key is order ID. Foreign key is customer ID reference to order or on order ID. Transaction had a transaction ID, items ID, salesperson ID, order ID, transaction date, discount price, total price. In transaction, there is a three primary key. The first one is transaction ID, second items ID, third salesperson ID. Their foreign key is 2. The first one is items ID, reference to transaction on transaction ID. Salesperson ID, reference to transaction on transaction ID. Order ID, reference to transaction on transaction ID. Then there is a salesperson. Salesperson attribute is salesperson ID, customer ID, transaction ID, salesperson name, full name, salesperson address, salesperson phone, salesperson email, commission rate, commission total. Their primary key is salesperson ID. Their foreign key is customer ID. Customer ID refers to salesperson on salesperson ID. Foreign key. The second foreign key is transaction ID, refers to salesperson on salesperson ID. Salesperson alternate key is salesperson phone, salesperson email. The last one is item. Item had an attribute, items ID, item transaction ID, items description, item price, item stock, category, color, size. The primary key is item ID. The foreign key is transaction ID, refers to items on items ID. Number 5 is